Hello and welcome to part 2 of my presentation, Lean and Mean or Frankenstein, Transforming Search Strategies for Rapid and Systematic Searching. In part 1 I demonstrated how it's unacceptable for searchers, for review teams, for funders to have to benchmark different standards of literature searching, all under the common banner of being for a systematic review. So I demonstrated tremendous variation in the number of records that needed to be retrieved in order to find a relevant reference, so the yield, and in the actual size of the result sets. And I concluded my part 1 presentation by suggesting that perhaps we should reverse engineer our search strategies so that we aim to deliver within particular rates or yields, and that would enable us to have an active and meaningful negotiation with review teams and with commissioners on the thoroughness with which we are conducting searches. I've suggested that it can be unacceptable to require review teams to wade through thousands of references with little expectation of a relevant reference, and that purely adding to the number of databases is not a sign of professional competence, but in fact could be construed as the reverse. And so the modest proposal which I concluded with in part 1 of this presentation was perhaps we would negotiate 3 levels of comprehensiveness depending on acceptable numbers needed to retrieve for a review team. And this would enable us to be explicit about the search strategy we construct, so constructing a search strategy that's fit for purpose and not against some standard that is purely in our own consciousness and expectation, certainly not a gold standard expectation. So how would we actually deliver against such a re-engineered approach? Well, interestingly, if you go back to the history of the Cochrane collaboration, the search strategy that they used for retrieving randomized controlled trials fell into a number of tiers, 3 tiers, each with decreasing levels of likelihood of retrieval of relevant references. And so what I'm suggesting isn't really that revolutionary or radical. It's just something that has been overlooked over the years, that we should think about not lumping together all appropriate subject terms for a single concept, regardless of their likely yield, but that we should actually construct our search strategies into tiers. And so, for example, the first tier would be subject headings, which are obviously likely to be more appropriate, and what we identify as core free text terms, perhaps even prominent in the title. And then our second tier might be to extend the terms beyond the title to include the abstract, and then a supplementary list of probable terms. And then finally, the more speculative terms, the ones that where the terms might just appear in passing within the record, or the terms that are more speculative in terms of not being so central to the concept. And this would enable us, if we did this indeed for each of the concepts within a PICO question, this would enable us to engineer or structure a series of options in terms of search comprehensiveness. And so if you think of a current search strategy, and this is just one plucked randomly from the systematic review, that you would go through the terms that you and the team came up with, and you would assign them prominence according to their likely usefulness and yield. And you could pilot some of the yields of these terms prior to finalizing your search strategy. Why would we focus so much on limiting the effort that goes into the topic search? Well, my argument is that given that we can retrieve, as mentioned in part 1 of this presentation, anything as many as 85% of the included studies from a single database, as particularly Medline, then this should release us, instead of searching an endless succession of additional databases, to think more about the role of complementary methods. And complementary methods currently get a raw deal for a number of reasons. Currently we focus on topic searches because they're easier to conduct. It's very easy to structure a search strategy in a database like Medline or Cinal. It's easier to import the records that we produce into reference management software, and to a certain extent we ignore or turn a blind eye to the possibility of bias. There is bias present. The journals selected by Medline are not based on any sort of representativeness across the world, but upon their suitability for a primarily American audience. And there's even selection in the databases we select. Many people, for example, say that they're not going to restrict by language, but they end up searching English language-based databases with just a scattering of non-English material. So some of the other things that we could be doing to productively harness our time. Citation searches is an underexplored area. It provides us with alternative entry points into the literature, particularly useful if the terminology is elusive or not very secure. The citation searches can be more current in the sense that certainly through Google Scholar you can be referencing articles that have just appeared, which makes them particularly useful in the context of update searches. They can yield fugitive literature because there isn't a requirement only to cite journals, unlike a topic search, which is mainly restricted to the journal literature. They can on the other hand, they have some limitations because people use citations for a number of reasons, not necessarily to use a citation because of topical similarity. It might be, for example, to illustrate a methodology or to illustrate transference across particular areas. And citation searches, of course, hold their own biases. We're all familiar that people are more likely to cite their own work, not necessarily through some maliciousness. It could well simply be that they're more aware of what they've done and hopefully can remember what they wrote in their articles. And citation searches are becoming increasingly easier to implement now because of the availability of publish or perish software that allows one to import Google Scholar references into reference management software or Excel, therefore taking away that sort of psychological barrier about using supplementary references. And if we go back to the data that I used from this random sample of reviews searched on Google Scholar, all of which used a librarian or an information specialist, so we take away that as a variable, we see quite a large proportion, certainly over a quarter of the reviews, found no references via supplementary sources. And this could partly be a documentation issue, but clearly it's unacceptable to find no references. And what the outcome of those references is another matter, but it does indicate that supplementary searching was either poorly targeted or poorly reported. I personally find the term grey literature an unhelpful term, but to think about it generically, it's far more efficient as an information specialist to be thinking about specific types of grey literature required for each topic or review, and then to generate sources or methods for those. So, for example, in a particular review, perhaps a qualitative synthesis, theses might be important, and so you would not develop a strategy for grey literature, you would develop a strategy to retrieve theses. And the challenge for us is to develop systematic, reproducible and defensible methods of complementary searching so that they meet the same rigour that already applies for topic searching. And at the very least, I would suggest that every included index paper could be citation searched to identify more recent studies citing that work, sibling reports that have originated from the same study, particularly to build up our picture of context, and kinship reports that may help us in writing the background or in interpreting the results. And together with a colleague, Chris Cooper, and his supervisors down at the University of Exeter, we've recently produced a couple of papers that actually look at supplementary search methods compared with the methodological handbooks in this particular instance, and a second study here that's looking at how supplementary searches made a much more significant contribution than the topic searches that tend to be the mainstay of many systematic reviews. And this is particularly indicated with a diffuse terminology, complex interventions, and literatures that go across multiple disciplines. So what am I arguing? Well, I'm arguing that we need to re-evaluate how we measure a good search. We need to move away from sensitivity and specificity. These are a bit akin to focusing on a pathologist's interpretation of lab results rather than thinking about what it actually means for the patient. We need to think about what our retrieval means for the actual review and not for some surrogate or intermediate measure. We need to move away from extolling the virtue of a total number of hits. A large number of hits is purely a sign of poor negotiation of the trade-off between retrieval and yield. And we need to move away from the big is beautiful picture of a total number of databases. And this would move us towards thinking about the impact of searches on the review, to thinking in terms of unique hits from different sources, so what is their additional contribution, thinking about the percentage that's identified through complementary or supplementary searching, thinking about two very important metrics: the conversion rate, that is the number of hits to full text articles, and then a conversion rate of full text articles to inclusion. And in support of the fact that we could focus on the impact of search strategies on the reviews themselves, so we move away from the idea of just extolling the number of raw hits identified. Here is a recent study by Hartling that found very high yields of between 75% and 92% for Medline as a key database, and arguing that supplementary search on a second database would then enhance the overall retrieval. But the important point is in two cases, a single case and in a further single case, these were the only results in changes in statistical significance. So very minor implications of two database searching in terms of loss of retrieval or loss of important results. So in summary then, what is not known, I introduced this in the first presentation. What we still need to know, if we're only going to search a limited number of databases, how do we decide which they are to be? We need to build up that evidence base. Again, if we're going to search for supplementary sources, which are the highest yields? So there's a tremendous evidence base retrieval agenda here. What benchmark should we use for retrieval to make sure that we make our searches more sensitive, and how can we improve our searching so that we do find all the studies that are included on a Medline database? And so I'd like to conclude by exhorting you to turn more attention to better searches of your main yield database than searching an endless list of increasingly obscure databases. And I finish by presenting the references that I've used in parts 1 and parts 2. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to hearing your feedback.